Hello boys and girls, friends old and new, welcome back to the channel. Today we have the grandfather of all Seiko high-bit watches, the Lord Marvel 5740. As you might see on the dial, it says 36,000, and that's the beats per hour. Let's listen to that. Sounds more like a machine gun toy, the kind we don't want our kids to use. But this is the thing with high beats. The whole idea is that the faster the balance oscillates, the less variation there would be in the timekeeping. That doesn't mean that a high beat watch will always be more accurate than a lower beat one, but it has a better chance of being so. So we saw that the watch is running, but it's not running very well. Quite a high beat error and low amplitude. What we do know is that Seikos in general have a lower amplitude than most watches. Lines were straight, however, so probably just service needed. So we're going to take off the cannon pinion with this slightly modified hand lifter. Just file the teeth down a little bit to make it grip better. On a high bit movement like this, the balance spring or hairspring is the biggest difference between that one and let's say lower beat movements. It's obviously got a much stiffer hairspring because it has to go back and forth much faster. Apart from that, it's a pretty conventional movement. See, it has a jeweled bearing for the barrel, which is a very good thing. So when I called it the grandfather of Seiko high beats, the reason is that this was the first high beat watch that Seiko introduced. The movement is 5740C, which of course indicates that there was an A and a B. And you know, it's like sometimes late at night typically, maybe you had a couple of beers or wine, and you see there's some cake left in the fridge. And first you take a little piece, and then you go back and say, yeah, I'll have another piece. And then you go back the last time and say, what the hell, I'll just take the rest. Never happened to me, but I heard stories. And that's a little bit the way it was with 5740 movements. The A version was a typical 18,000 beats per hour. Then they upped that to 19,800. And then I thought, what the hell? Let's just go the full Monty, and they upped it to 36,000. At that time, there was a bit of an arms race in the watch manufacturing industry. So Girard Perregaux had already introduced their 36,000 just a year before in 1966. Anyway, while talking, we've been disassembling the movement. So I just thought I also wanted to show you the process of putting the pieces into the basket. So some of these pieces we need to pre-clean, like the different small pinions. And the delicate pieces we're going to put into a small basket. And if there are some very delicate springs, we're not even going to put them in the cleaning machine. Just clean them by hand. But a cleaning machine is a great invention, of course. My theory is that there's always a business opportunity that focuses on laziness. So if you can take some effort away from people, they will pay for it. Count me in. We're going to reuse the same mainspring, because even though the amplitude was low, the spring looked just fine, apart from being dirty. I'm putting just a little drop of 9-10 on the capstones. And Seikos use this Dfix system, which is really just a name for shock protection. This little 3-armed spring here is very similar to the KIF Trior or the Novodiak. A little bit fiddly sometimes, but not too difficult. What can be quite fiddly, however, is the Dfix system that they use on other train wheels. We'll get back to that a little bit later. We're gonna use Fix-A-Drop, Epilam on the escape wheel and the pallet fork. And then we're gonna stick the pivots into some pith wood. I said pegwood last time, but it's pith wood, of course, just to make sure there's no residue on the pivots. And I do have a little case of the sniffles today. I read this book for my 5-year-old yesterday, What to Do If Your Elephant Has the Sniffles, and then I caught it. Luckily the elephant is fine. Just a quick note on the use of finger cuts. So we use them on the clean movement parts to prevent from leaving stains, because there's a little bit acid in the fat in our skin. But we don't need to use finger cuts when we disassemble a watch, because it will all be cleaned away anyway. Now I mentioned this Dfix system. And when you have a watch with those 2 little clips that you see here, it's best just to leave them in place and just oil them from the underside. They're not really there for shock protection. It's just to hold the capstone in place to allow the wheels to run better. But they're fiddly to take off and get back on again. So in the beginning of the video, I referred to this watch as the grandfather of Seiko high beats, because it was the first one. But it's also interesting that it was introduced in a Lord Marvel and not in a King Seiko and Grand Seiko, which had already been introduced a few years earlier. And I haven't really found, let's say, an official reason for this. But Lord Marvel was the top line before the King Seiko and Grand Seiko. And it seems reasonable that they would sort of test run the high beats in an established line before they put it in a newer line. Even though King Seiko and Grand Seiko were, of course, pinnacle of Seikos. But the movement itself is pretty basic in a lot of ways. See that the finishing is not really a big priority. And the overall design of the movement also is a little bit less elegant, perhaps, than, for instance, the 4502, which this movement can be said to be a precursor to. And for the finishing, we kind of discussed that in some other Seiko videos. It's never really been a big focus for Seiko to finish everything to the highest standard. That has changed, of course, in the later years. I think especially in the dials, recent Grand Seikos are probably the finest you can find anywhere. But for these older watches, the movements are typically very much focused on performance and not on looks. It's simply a different philosophy from the likes of Vacheron or Patek or Audemars, those guys, with fantastic finish, as well, of course, as fantastic performance. But you pay for it as well. That's kind of why I like to say that if you strip a Patek of all the high-end finishing, you have a Seiko. Let's get the balance in and set the watch running. There's no hacking on this watch. There's no date, no nothing besides just timekeeping. For the pallet stones, when we have a high bit movement, we need to use grease instead of an oil, because an oil could be flung off because of the fast movement. That said, you can never really go wrong by using a grease on any watch. What I'm using here is 9415. And then we can oil the last pivot, demagnetize the watch, and see how it runs now. Well, it still runs like an energizer bunny being chased by a pack of lions. So we'll first adjust the beat error with that mobile stud carrier, and then we'll adjust the timekeeping by moving the index pins. And lastly, we'll use this fine regulator to get it just to the seconds we want. And that looks pretty good, so we're going to be happy with that. This is not a chronometer, so it's not adjusted to a lot of positions, so there will be some positional error, but it's going to be fine. For the case, it looks fine. It also looks like it's never been polished. So this is a question of philosophy. And as people who viewed my channel before know, I'm pretty conservative in this way. I think an old watch should look like an old watch. Probably because I'm an old guy and I look like an old guy. Hey, what is that supposed to mean? Well, I suppose you do have a point. It would be nice to be restored to being 25 again, but that train has left the station. I don't know, it's just something with the fumes and the sound of the ultrasonic that makes me sentimental. So the jury has reached a verdict. We're not going to polish the case, given that it's not been polished before. We are, however, going to shine it up a little bit using this Never Dull product. And I think that name actually refers to the fumes it lets off. You never have a dull moment if you sniff a lot of that. For the crystal, Seiko uses the same concept as Rolex. The crystal fits like a cap onto the case, and then you press the bezel on the outside. Gonna use the crystal press for the bezel. And with that snap, we know it's in place. Can be a bit hard sometimes. The dial is in fine condition. It's got a couple of small marks, but nothing too bad. You often see some marks on these old Seiko dials, especially around the edges. Probably from the type of varnish they used. And given that it's not a calendar watch or a date watch, we can put the hour hand anywhere we want. But of course, we need to make sure that the minute hand is aligned to the full hour. Now you'll see here that I'm actually pressing it on at 3 minutes past. That's because I got a little bit disturbed. And then just have to use experience and judgment in putting it on. But it lines up nicely. And then the seconds hand. And of course, the coolest thing with the 36,000 BPH watch is how smooth the seconds hand runs. Let's see why that is. The seconds hand makes 10 steps every second. So normal speed, that looks very smooth. All right, let's case the watch. I want to talk about the finishing a little bit. It's a beautiful little movement. It's just not overdone. And as you might know, Seiko is one of my absolute favorite brands. Part of the reason for that is, of course, seeing it on the wrist. Just very elegant, timeless, stylish. Hope you liked this video. If you did, then clicking like and subscribe will really help the channel. We'll be back shortly. Until then, tata.